Good evening. This week's Parsha, Parshat Tetzaveh, is a very famous Parsha for the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not mentioned in the entire Parsha. That means if you go back to the beginning of Sefer Shemos and you go through Vayikra, Bamidbar, you go through all the Sfarim, you will see that Moshe Rabbeinu's name is mentioned in every single Sedra. I think there's one Sedra in Devarim, but that was Mishnah Torah. But in the main Chumashim of Shemos, Vayikra, and Bamidbar, his name is mentioned every single Parsha, but not Parshas Tetzaveh. This Parsha. And we know that next week in Parshas Kisisa, Moshe Rabbeinu put himself forward and laid himself on the line for Klal Yisrael, for the Jewish people. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu said after the story of the Egel, of the golden calf, let me just destroy all the people and I'll start fresh with you. We'll build up a nation and you'll be the beginning, person number one. Moshe Rabbeinu answered and said he didn't want to hear of that. He wanted Hashem to forgive them. And he said, if you don't forgive them, v'im ayin, mecheni no misifrecha asher kosovta. Erase me from your book. Take my name out. Which was a little bit of a criticism to Moshe Rabbeinu to speak like that to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered and said, the one who offended me is the one that I will have to take out of the Sefer, not you. But the way he said it was a drop out of order, and therefore his name is not mentioned at all in Parshas Tetzaveh. This was the final time in next week's Sedra that Moshe Rabbeinu put himself on the line for Klal Yisrael to that level. And at that level. And it was a tikkun because the Kadmoinim and the Mekubalim say that Noach, the criticism to Noach is that he was a tzaddik, the pasuk says it, but he never davened for his generation. He never davened for them. And that's why he had to come back as Moshe Rabbeinu. Some of the Kabbalah Sfarim say that Hevel came back as Moshe Rabbeinu, and others say that it was Noach who came back as Moshe Rabbeinu, and they point out that just like Noach's life was saved through a teva, through an ark, Moshe Rabbeinu's life began and was saved by a little ark, by a little rowboat, a little cradle. And they bring, and that's why the name of the one who saved him was Basya Basparo, and the letters of Basya is Teva. If you change around the order of the letters, it was Teva, pointing to the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu came back with a job to fix up that which he did not do as Noach. And davening, and that's why we find that he's constantly davening. They're doing this, they're doing that, and he has to stand up and defend them and daven for them and do everything that he does. Now, the word mecheni, erase me, is the letters me noyach. Mecheni, memches nun yud. If you change the order, it's again a remez to the fact that he had to daven for them. But the fact is that his name was taken out of Parshas Tetzaveh because of how he spoke. He said, erase me, and it was erased.
It's not in the Haggadah either.
I'm sorry?
It's not in the Haggadah either. Moshe's name.
Yeah, no, that's because it was complete. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he was so involved in the Yeshua of Klal Yisrael from Mitzrayim that one would think that maybe he was like a shutef with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was HaKadosh Baruch Hu did it. His name is only mentioned when we quote the pasuk Vayosha Hashem Bayom Ahu, V'Moshe Vayaminu B'Hashem V'Moshe Avdu. It's just quoting a pasuk, but it's not portraying him as the one who brought about the Yeshua. He was a very glorified, goodwill ambassador on behalf of Klal Yisrael, but it was a Yeshua that came completely from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, Rav Ovadia Yosef Zechrona Levracha used to often say the fact that why did Moshe Rabbeinu say Misifrecha, from your Sefer? He could have just said erase my name from the Sefer, from the Torah. So he pointed out, and he said as a chiddush from himself, that the word Misifrecha is Misefer Chof, because if you count from the beginning of Bereshis to Parshas Tetzaveh, it's exactly 20 Parshios. So he said, take me out, Misefer Chof, in your Torah, the 20th. Chof is 20.
Wow, that's good.
Take me out of Misefer Chof. Why did Moshe Rabbeinu want, according to that pshat, Dafka, if his name's not going to be somewhere, he didn't want it in Tetzaveh? So the answer is, that Meforshim say, is because originally Moshe Rabbeinu was supposed to be the Kohen Gadol. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to him, I want you to go to Paro and tell him that's it, it's time that the Jews have to leave, and the whole beginning of the Exodus of, Yetzias Mitzrayim, Moshe Rabbeinu for a week disagreed and argued with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm tongue-tight, I'm this, I'm that, I'm not the one to go. He was arguing. So at the end, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said that since you didn't just accept what I asked you to do, therefore you're losing, you were supposed to become the Kohen Gadol and you're losing it. Now when Aaron HaKohen participated with the Egel, and he wasn't participating because he wanted the Egel, he was trying to buy time, to stall that the people should do, because Moshe Rabbeinu said he's coming back on the 40th day. He knew it was going to happen. Just the Satan was out, because if they never would have made that Egel, then Mashiach would have been here then, and there would have been the Geula Shlema, and no tsaris, no sickness, no death, no all these things that we've had for 3,300 years to this day never would have been. So the Satan, the Medrash says, went all out. They showed Klal Yisrael a bed in the clouds of Moshe Rabbeinu that he died. Forget about Moshe Rabbeinu. But Aaron answered and said, if he said he's coming back on the 40th day, he will. And he did. But they didn't have the patience to wait. They were already in the morning. Well, it's the 40th day. Where is he? So because Aaron, even though with the greatest and purest of intention, did what he did, but he was still, and the pasuk even says, Es ha'egel asher osa Aharon. That's what the pasuk says, as if to put the blame almost on him for what happened. So Aaron lost the Kahuna Gedola, and it went back to Moshe Rabbeinu. The Moshe Rabbeinu pleaded with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, don't do that to Aaron. I lost the Kahuna Gedola, and I'm going to be the leader and the Navi. And Aaron HaKohen now lost it, and you want to give it back to me and make him the Navi and the leader. I'm begging you, please don't do that. And that's why in Shmini, Moshe Rabbeinu says to Aaron at the beginning, when the Mishkan was ready to go ahead and to do what they had to do, Moshe Rabbeinu, the pasuk says, he said to Aaron, Karav el hamizbeach va'aseyes chatoscha ve'esolasecha. That go ahead, begin the avodah. And Aaron was very hesitant. The Medrash says he didn't want to go. He said, after the eagle and everything that had caused all the trouble and everything, how could I go forward? And that's why what he brought as the first things was a kapara for the eagle. That's why but Moshe Rabbeinu had to push him and say, Krav, go ahead, El HaMizbeach, and begin. Va'aseyes chatoscha ve'esolasecha. So Aaron at the end ended up Kohen Gadol, and Moshe Rabbeinu ended up as leader, but it wasn't so simple in their lifetime. This went back and it went forth every single time. Now Moshe Rabbeinu, you see many people, if they're destined for something, and at the end, for whatever reason, somebody else ends up with the position, and if the person, let's say, who could have had it or would have had it, keeps bringing up the topic in one way or another to remind the person, that was mine, really. That was something that I could have had, and I just deferred to you, or I helped you. So Moshe Rabbeinu, this Parshas Tetzaveh, talks about kahuna and the big day kahuna of the Koyanim and the Kohen Gadol and everything that had to happen and take place. Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want to be in the shadow because it would have casted the image, kahuna Gedola, I was the one that really was supposed to be there. He wanted it to be clean and free, the glory for the Tiferes of Aaron HaKohen, that he should be in full luster of the glory of Kahuna Gedolah, without his brother lurking behind him in the shadow with the memories that he really could have had it or would have had it had he not stood up and said no. And that really is, in the biggest sense, like a good sport. That a person sometimes gives in or helps the other person, but they don't want the other person to forget it. And they keep throwing it out from the sideline in supposedly a tactful way to insert the reminder that the person should never forget. So Moshe Rabbeinu didn't want that his name even should be mentioned in Tetzaveh when it talks about Big Day Kahuna. And that's why it was specifically this Sedra that he wanted to be left out of, rather than anything else.
And this was a good argument for Korach, and even this he didn't accept. Moshe kept saying, I don't want to be the Kohen, and Korach still attacked him. But he wants everything.
Yeah, Korach really had in mind that he was a Levi, and that Liosad Lovo, that Mashiach will come, that Levium will supersede the Kohanim. So he wanted to bring that period of time, and the Medrash says he was right, and it's going to be like he wanted, but not now. The Lashon of the Medrash says, Achla Poga, he ate it unripe. Like when you take a completely green banana. The banana's a banana, but it's not the exact time that you should eat it because it's not ready to be eaten, and that was the story with Korah. Now, we know that, and many Sfarim talk about this whole thing, why his name was not mentioned. Every Rav darshans on it, everything. There were Avnei Miluim, and there was the Avnei Shoham. The Avnei Miluim were 12 stones on the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol, and it had the names of the Shivtei, all the tribes. On the Avnei Shoham, which were 2 stones at the top of the apron, the straps at the top, was also the names of the Shvatim. So the question is asked, why did you need two things on the begodim of the Kohen Gadol to have the names of the Shvatim? One would have been enough. But the Meforshim say, in other words, there's a difference between the Avnei Miluim, because you were not allowed to engrave or hew or insert into the stones anything. So how did the names get on? How did the names of the Shvatim? So the Gemara says that there was a shamir. Shamir is like a type of a worm that they were able to put it on the big stones, and it was able to cut through like razor sharp, that it could just move according to how they wanted it to move, and it could cut even the thickest, biggest stone. And all, when you go to the Koisel Amaravi, and you see that all that was done by the shamir, that was all in place, and it was all because the actual stone were rough and points on the stone that were not straight. But how did it become straight? Through the shamir. So it says on the Avnei Miluim that you couldn't engrave or etch out anything. So the shamir came, it wasn't done humanly, and the tzivui, the command, was to humans, and the shamir was not human, so it was able to do whatever it had to do to get the names on each stone. And it was allowed, the Gemara says this. The Avnei Shoyam, there you were able to etch in, you were able to engrave, you were able to hew, you were able to put in the names without any problem. So, but it comes back to the original question, what do you need two for? To have the names on the Kohen Gadol. So, interestingly, Meforshim say that there are two types of issues that a leader has to deal with. And leader doesn't just mean a Rav in a shul with 1,500 talesim Shabbos morning. It could be a parent. A parent is for a child, for a grandchild, a leader, what to do, what not to do, what would be good for them, what would not be good for them. That's leadership. So there's a type of, every person who has that role, there's two types of issues. There's the issue that they can't do anything about. I mean, somebody could talk to a person and cry about shidduchim, or cry about not having, let's say, children, or not having parnasa. And the person they're crying to really cannot do anything. I mean, if they hear of something, a job, they can say, but there's nothing on that moment that's min hashamayim, that they're in that state, and they have to daven. Through their davening, they could break through the ice. But when it comes to actual bottom line, the only thing the person can do is extend patience, sympathy, and listen. And sometimes that's the biggest mitzvah. I mean, the person who has something on their mind, and even if you can do nothing, but you're willing to listen for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and give the person the solace of comfort that they're sharing it and they're expressing it. So that in and of itself is a tremendous thing, that you can talk to someone and they can listen, but they only can listen and sympathize, but in action it doesn't happen. But then there's the other type of problem, that a person could hear that the person doesn't have a job, and the person's thinking, well, I could call two people who maybe need a worker, maybe need someone, so they could set into actual action and do something. So there's the area of problem that all you can do is sympathize and listen. And then you have the area where you can actually do something to help the person. So the Avnei Miluim represented that you could not etch into it or hew it but the names came on it, for the leaders, that there's a problem. The Kohen Gadol had to deal with a flock of people, and he had to deal with all sorts of situations, and he was able to effectively help the people by just being there and promoting atmosphere to envelop the person from the state of despondency, disappointment, depression, whatever it is, by the mere fact that they were listening and sympathizing. And that was the Avnei Miluim, that you couldn't go in and etch into it. You had to take the Shamir, an outside force. But the Avnei Shoam represent actual action, that it's on the shoulders, that when somebody takes on a responsibility or to do something, the mere fact that they're doing it, that's a burden on their shoulders. And that's what the Avnei Shoam, because the two stones were right here. They were right on top of the shoulder of the Kohen Gadol. And that is the message to us, to equate inaction, sympathy, with actual action. A person should never say to someone who's troubled, well, there's nothing that I could do. By listening to them, sometimes you're giving them the opportunity to express themselves and to bring out what's on their heart. Now, the beginning of the Seder mentions the menorah. And it says, Shemen Zayizach Lahalos Ner Tamid, and the Gemara says that it has to be madlik. He's madlik, the Kohen is madlik the menorah. He goes over and lights the menorah ad shalheves oile me'eleha, until it goes by itself. In other words, he's not allowed to take away his hand until he sees that the fire caught on and it's continuing. Now, Meforshim are quick to underscore that is the job of every parent and every leader and every teacher. That means we can have in our house a message for 20 years for a child, and we could try to be the example of that message. But if we don't ignite the heart and the mind of the child or the student in a classroom, that it catches fire and it from itself wants to continue whatever the issue is. They're talking about a specific mitzvah, that you can give the child the esrog and the lulav, but when they get married, if they don't go out and buy an esrog and a lulav, it didn't catch fire. They didn't feel the panemius, that the esrog is the heart and the others are the einayim and the lips and the shedra. It's the composition of a person. So important, especially that it reflects the heart, that we're supposed to start on Chamisha Osir B'Shvat, davening for a beautiful esrog. 8 months before. 8 months before the esrog has anything to do. You can take then an esrog, but it's meaningless. But we're supposed to daven for it. Because since so many faculties of the heart, which cause us and propel us to do certain things that we do each and every day, it's from the heart. The heart is choimed. It's the seichel that tells us do it, don't do it, is it right, how to do it. But the desire to want us to do it is from the heart, and the heart is connected to the esrog. So our avoida is intrinsically connected to that esrog, that we're worried about 8 months before, what kind of an esrog min hashamayim are they going to send us? That type of idea of the esrog, if it's instilled and inculcated to the child, then there's a warmth that's ignited, and he won't just look at the Esrog and go, okay, it's a beautiful mitzvah and nice, and the Torah says, the Gemara says, Zakeli v'anveyu. So that is the job of Lahalos. The Reb Shamshon Foil Hirsch speaks a lot on this, what I'm just saying now, about Lahalos Ner Tamid, that it should be Oila Me'eleha, that a Rav who didn't, the Zohar Kodesh says that, the Yerushalmi says that if a person on Shabbos is not well, but really not well, I'm not talking about their finger is hurting them, or they may have a drop of fever, something slight. But let's say they come to a person and they take his temperature. The person's 25 years old, so you wouldn't really call that person a baby. And 105 fever by an adult is much more severe than by a baby. And the person, it's Shabbos, and he starts to think, wait a second, should I ask a shayla? Am I allowed to call a doctor now? So the Yerushalmi calls the Rov of that person a Rotzeach. He's considered a murderer. Because if you were his Rov and he didn't realize, you see 105 fever, you run to get the doctor, whether you have to call the doctor. He didn't realize that, but he was more worried about the Shmir Shabbos, and do I ask a shayla? That Rav is called a Rotzeach, because he did not properly condition his tzibur to understand the value of life and the halachas which are involved. Now, a person has to be very careful. That means he can become a Machal Shabbos with always say, well, she said she wasn't feeling so well, so I ran to call the doctor. And he can be really Machal Shabbos and be chayav for it, because he was just acting on his own emotion or whatever it is. He wasn't thinking. But if a person thinks, and you have to have the capacity. I'll never forget, I was once listening to the radio, and some reporter asked a sports player, a football player, a basketball player, when they got done with the game, what do you think about this and that? And the guy was stammering to answer, because half the people, we don't think. This guy, he was making $20 million a year, but when he was asking, what do you think? Do they ever stop to use their minds or to think? Some of them can't even think properly. So a Rav has to teach a person how to think. How do you react? And if this guy was with a person that could have died with a 105 fever, that he's busy considering, well, was this considered Chil Shabbos? Maybe I should first run to the Rav and ask him a shayla, and not realize the emergency. Then it was a failure on the Rav's part, and he never communicated and taught his tzibur to rise to the occasion. Now, later in the Sedra, it says, V'hilbashta osam, the first time that these begodim, these garments, were put on the Kohen Gadol and the Kohen, it was put by the Kohen Gadol, Moshe Rabbeinu put it on Aaron, and he put it on, and when Aaron HaKohen later in Parshat Chukas was nifter, so he took off the begodim and he put them onto Elazar, his son. But throughout the life of Aaron, he dressed himself. So why the first time did he have to put it on for him? He understood how to wear them and what to do. why did Moshe Rabbeinu specifically put on the first time, and then the first time for Elazar, who became Kohen Gadol in his father's place after his Petira? So the Mefarshim say because Yiddish leadership is different than Goyish leadership. And by Yidden, we never, that means when there was somebody who was about to be nifter, he alluded to who he thought should take over to Paskin for the Tzibur, whatever. But no one jumped up. We never found somebody that after, let's say, Rav Moshe Feinstein was the Poisek Ador, that somebody jumped up and said, let's say his son Reb David, who really was closest to his father. I don't think there was anybody ever in America who was at the level of Rav Moshe Feinstein in terms of paskening. Every Rebbe and everywhere acknowledged that he was the Poisek Ador. I once was sent to Eretz Yisrael by a group of Rosh Yeshiva, and I went with another Rav who was not living. He was 30 years older than I was. This was a story like when I was at 28 or 30. I was a youngster, and I still can't imagine and understand why they wanted me to go. But anyway, we spoke to Rav. We went to ask a certain shaila to Rav Elyashiv, to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and at that time it was Dayan Weiss, who was the head of the Eda Charedis. And like Rav Elyashiv said to the two of us, that when we have a shaila that's nogeya all of Eretz Yisrael, we don't take it on our shoulders. Only Rav Moshe Feinstein can paskin for Gans Klal Yisrael. And Rav Moshe never lived in Eretz Yisrael. He lived on the east side here in Manhattan. But it was acknowledged he was the Poisek Ador. Now, before he was nifter, he spoke with his son very much about certain things of how to respond to different groups, and so it was like an appointment, an unofficial, quiet appointment, but it wasn't something that Rav David Feinstein jumped up and said, well, now I am the new Poisek Ador, which he may have been, because there were many Rabbanim very seasoned, capable, Talmidei Chachamim, Poiskim, who said that Rav David was Roy, and that they asked Rav Moshe to ask Rav David. And Rav David was as simple as could be. He went every week to buy for himself and his Rebbetzin pizza. And when he came into the pizza store, the line always jumped aside for him, and he never accepted he thanked them, but he stood in line like everybody else. So, but he was never self-appointed. He was always, there was some sort of appointment. Where did that come from? That v'hilbashtem, that when Moshe Rabbeinu put on the clothes for the first time, that was like an acknowledgement. It was a validation of how they should accept the mantle of leadership, and that there should always be a heskem, a nod, an agreement, that we don't rush to take a mantle of leadership on our own when it comes to dealing with Klal Yisrael, the Piskei Halacha, and the teaching and the derech of what they should do and how they should do. Now, it says that in the Parsha, that Shivas Yomim, there's a pasuk in this week's Parsha that they should do the avodah like this. And then the pasuk uses the word Tachtov Ubanov. And from those two words, the Gemara learns that a Kohen Gadol, when he dies, the first choice, it, it goes to his children, to a son. Now, for states, that's only if the son is roy and whatever, but before they start looking elsewhere, they have to allow the room for the son to be appointed. Now, there was such a thing as a Kohen Mashuach Milchama, and this was a very interesting position. When Klal Yisrael went out to war, there was a trumpet which was sounded, like proclaiming we're going into war, and it was the Kohen Mashuach Milchama. That means there were some of them, there was never a war. They were a Kohen Mashuach Milchama, and they have never ended up doing anything because there was no war, and they used to get up and they read the Parsha. Somebody who is timid and afraid of war, go back home. That whole speech of that Parsha was said by the Kohen Mashuach Milchama. And the Kohen Mashuach Milchama. Now, it says specifically that the Kohen Mashuach Milchama, his son did not inherit. And even the Sagan Kohen Gadol had less chashivas than this Kohen Mashuach Milchama. If you go through the whole list of what were his responsibilities and his responsibility, that there was much more deference given to the Kohen Mashuach Milchama as opposed to the Sagan Kohen Gadol. So why would by the Kohen Gadol there be a Yerusha to his children if they're fitting and proper, and not to the Kohen Mashuach Milchama? And the answer the Meforshim say is because Yerusha is about continuity. That means if this man was Zoicha to be the Kohen Gadol, then that is included in his schus, that his children should be able to continue and have that continuity. But the main job of the Kohen Mashuach Milchama was Milchama, war. And war is not part and parcel of the fabric of the Jewish people. We are a people that when the Pasuk in Vayechi says, Becharbi uvekashti, so the Targum right away says, and Rashi points it out, Bitzloisi uvavusi, that through my davening and my begging, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, my prayer, my davening, that's the way Yidden act. When we need something, we don't go out with a gun. Where did you find that there were times they were compelled. A nation came to fight with them, they had to defend themselves. But in a normal case of in Eretz Yisrael, they're looking for war with the Arabs. They're looking for peace, that they should be able to daven and to do whatever they're doing there. They're not looking for any war, any reaction was when they were attacked, or somebody was killed, or there was a bomb or a grenade thrown in a restaurant. So there was reaction, but it wasn't action, it was reaction. And that's the reason that the Kohen Mashuach Milchama was not Yerusha, because he had to stand there and he really raised the level of going out to a war and what it meant. It was like a pure ruchness, even though that they were fighting. But the kavana and the intention and the outcome was purely for that, because we are a people who never wanted to engage in any type of violence. And it was only when the essence, like a case of Amalek, that there, the essence of Amalek, which the Torah says, so that's what we rely on, it was so bad that at its core, it was evil. So we have a mitzvah to wipe out. Because in their essence, they're bad and they want to wipe us out. Any good in the world. But in terms of living amongst people, that is how we deal with nations of the world and how we live ourselves within that realm. And I just want to say to you that since there are 2 Adors this year, when it comes to the first Ador, we have Purim, of course, in the second Ador. When it comes to the first, it's called Purim Kotan. And interestingly, the Ramah, and we paskin like the Ramah, the Svardim paskin like the Bais Yosef, like the Mechaber. So, like the Mechaber. But we, Ashkenazim, we paskin like the Ramah, and the very last statement in Orach Chaim, in the Shulchan Aruch, that deals with brachos, deals with tefillin, deals with tzitzis, deals with Shabbos, deals with the essence of how we have to live our lives each and every day, that it's called, there are 4 chalokim in Shulchan Aruch, and that's called Orach Chaim. Orach Chaim. And the very last statement of the Ramah in the whole Orach Chaim is a sif about Purim Kotan, which means the Purim in Adar Aleph. We don't give Shalach Manas or Matanos L'Evyonim, but it says we don't say Tachnun on that day, and it's only 1 sif, 1 siman with 1 sif in it. We don't fast in that day. And he ends with the words from Mishlei and says, V'tov leiv mishte tomid. V'tov leiv, and a good-hearted person, mishte tomid, will always be merry with a l'chaim, with the. And the Meforshim are like beside it. That's the way the Ramah wants to end Orach Chaim, with the words V'tov leiv. It's a pasuk from Mishlei. But the Gemara says that V'tov leiv means, there's a beginning. That's only 4 words from a pasuk in Mishlei that begins, Kol Yemei Oni Ro'im. That all the days of a person are very bad. They're like very difficult. He's living his whole life worrying about, will I get the money for the gas bill, or am I going to end up without any gas? And what would I do? Should I go to the neighbor? He's occupied with what is he going to do because he doesn't have any money to pay a bill. But the Gemara says that that's not what it's going on. Kol Yemei Ani Ro'im is going on a person who learns Mishnah but never got to the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch. So he can quote to you anything in a Mishnah, and he can be very scholarly and erudite and make a nice impression, but when it comes to a shaila in living, in practical living, he never got to the Gemara and he never got to the Shulchan Aruch. So that's what the pasuk is referring to when it says Kol Yemei Ani Ro'im, that although he was an Ani poor in terms of his learning, he only got up to a certain point. And V'tov leiv mishte tamid is going on to the one who did get to the Gemara, and the Gemara says this. So the point being that we should work to bring to fruition. Many times we're standing there, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Oh, this year I had made up, I'm going to be going to the nursing home, I'm feeding 15 aniyim, or I'm going to go into the grocery store and pay up the bill, ask the grocery man, who is the poorest person here with a bill? And, well, there's somebody has an $800, here's the $800. But half the things that we take on and with the best of intention, we never end up doing. And a man is supposed to be learning Torah, and he said, well, I really didn't do this, and I was busy with shtussim and nonsense, and this year I'm going to finish 3 Masechtas, and he doesn't do it at the end. This V'tov Leiv Mishta Tamid means bring to fruition all of your good intentions. Because this is the Olam HaMaisa. That means if somebody takes a pair of tefillin, and he's holding the tefillin, but he didn't put it on, and he's thinking the deepest kavanas, the kavanas of the Arizal, and this, Alpi Kabbalah, this and that, and at the end of the day, he never put on the tefillin. This is the Olam HaMaisa. If you didn't put on the tefillin, it's a big 0. But I was thinking about the purest and pristine, this is not the Olam of Machshava. This is the Olam HaMaisa. Now, of course, the Rambam says that if a person has bad Machshavas, it's worse than doing the things, because it is affecting negatively and polluting the source of where the action. There's a person first has a Machshava, and then he follows through with the action. But if you pollute the source, and so that's what the Rambam says. But we, from this Tov Leiv Mishta Tamid, expresses the idea of how important it is to have our feet on the ground and running. That stop. And Rav Pam Zechron Levrach always used to say on Rosh Hashanah that many people, Rosh Hashanah, they're excellent. And 6 months and 10 months later, when they think about it, oh yeah, I'm not doing really so well. I said it was this, I'm just going to do that and that. He says, you have to mark your report cards at the end of every month. Don't wait 10 months. Stop and think, on Rosh Hashanah I was standing there and I'm thinking about the family and I'm thinking about miyichya, miyomos, I'm thinking about all these, and I'm promising this and I'm accepting that, and then the months fly by. Don't let it fly by. He said these words, mark your report card at the end of every month and say, well, how am I doing Lamaisa? Was I just fooling myself? Was I just saying, well, people live through their lives with the word well, I tried with the big well, and they end up at the starting point. Because unfortunately, if someone runs up the stairs to the train and he's taking a subway and he has to get somewhere, and the train pulls up, the doors open, and people are coming on and off the train, and he's standing there, and the doors close, and he's still standing there. And the next train comes, and again, people are coming and going, and he's standing there. And at the end of the day, he says, I had to get to that place. We all agree you had to get to that place. But you never got on the train. The door opened for you. It was fully air-conditioned or heated. You had a seat to go, but you never took the step. And that has to be our job, to be awake and to constantly assess, what are we doing with our days, our hours, our time? Time is life. And we are given the golden opportunities to make the most of these opportunities and time. And we just have to avail ourselves and push ourselves to do it. Not to be lazy and not let the Yetzer Hara win the argument. Thank you and have a good evening.